Politics was always in the room. WHO mission chief reflects on China trip seeking COVID-19's origin. So this is an interview by Science, one of the two most important scientific journals in the world, with the mission leader, Peter Ben Mbarak, who we haven't heard as much from because Peter Daszak was sort of the, self-appointed, otherly appointed spokesperson mostly. But let us just go to a few of these questions. Here we go. Question. At Friday's press conference in Geneva, Tedros seemed to contradict you by saying that with respect to the origins of SARS-CoV-2, quote, all hypotheses are on the table. Was it a mistake to call the lab origin hypothesis extremely unlikely? Mbarak answers, no. We first developed a pathway of all the possible ways the virus could be introduced into the human population in late 2019. A lab accident is one hypothesis. Another is the direct introduction from an animal host, and others are different versions of intermediary hosts. For each hypothesis, we tried to put facts on the table, look at what we had in terms of arguments, and then make an assessment of each. It was already a big step to have Chinese colleagues assess and evaluate such a hypothesis based on what we had on the table, which was not much. Yes, lab accidents do happen around the world. They have happened in the past. The fact that several laboratories of relevance are in and around Wuhan and are working with coronavirus is another fact. Beyond that, we didn't have much in terms of looking at that hypothesis as a likely option. So like asterisk, yes, you did. But okay, let's go back into the interview for a moment. Question. But what led you to use the extremely unlikely label? Did you learn anything that made it less likely? Answer. Again, Mbarak speaking. We should not put too much focus on the wording. We were looking at different options. At some point, we were thinking, should we use a ranking, with 1 being the most unlikely, 5 the most likely, or should we use colors? Or should we find another scale? We ended up with a 5-phrase scale. Extremely unlikely, unlikely, possible, likely, and very likely. It's more an illustration of where these hypotheses are to help us organize our planning of future studies. Question. But my question is whether you learned anything new in China. Now that you've been there, do you have more reason to say it's extremely unlikely than before? Translation. Answer my damn question, dude. Answer. Again, Mbarak. Yes. We had long meetings with the staff of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and 3 other laboratories in Wuhan. I can't even do this with a straight face. They talked about these claims openly. We discussed. What did you do over the past year to dismiss this claim? What did you yourself develop in terms of argumentations? Did you do audits yourself? Did you look at your records? Did you test your staff? And they explained how they worked and what kind of audit system they had. They had retrospectively tested serum from their staff. They tested samples from early 2019 and from 2020. There were a lot of discussions that we could not have had if we had not traveled to Wuhan. We also did not have evidence provided by outsiders to support any of the claims out there. That could potentially have tipped the balance. What we saw and discussed gave us much more confidence in our assessment. The consensus was that this is an unlikely scenario. We also had difficulties designing future studies to look into the laboratory claims within our joint group because if you want to explore such a hypothesis further, you need a different mechanism. You need to do a formal audit, and that's far beyond what our team is mandated to do or has the tools and capabilities to do. So that was also a reason why we could not start moving forward in our next series of studies into that direction. But the fact that the hypothesis is listed or assessed as extremely unlikely is not the same as if it had been listed or assessed as impossible. We're not closing the door.
We're not closing the door because it's swollen and we can't get it to close.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like,
and sorry, but we looked at a number of different schemes, and probably you wouldn't be upset with us if we just said it was purple instead of highly unlikely. We thought about using language, and we thought about using colors, and we thought about using just because we landed on this scheme doesn't really mean anything. It's
and we thought
yes,
about
but it does. What are you talking about?
We thought about having a guy with a uniform stand there and say, "Nothing to see here, folks. Go on home."
Yeah, don't look at the man behind the curtain.
Don't look at the man. Yeah,
there's infinite numbers of versions of what are you doing? You're not compelling. This is not a compelling interview.
Now, interestingly.
Yes.
Let us compare this. Hey, Zach, do you want to put up I sent you a paper. This is not a peer-reviewed paper, but it takes the form of a manuscript, and it is by authors who actually have advanced so this is Latham and Wilson. And this paper is basically an analysis of how likely it is that China that there is a natural origin intermediate to be found, which was a large part of the discussion that we did last week. And they attempt to quantify the chances. And actually this analysis, although I'm going to argue that it is flawed, I think it is flawed in a way that the natural scientific process would cause their estimate to be refined. But the analysis centers on some very interesting and important pieces of evidence, one of them being phylogenetic and the other geographic.
Okay.
Right? And the point of the analysis is that if you look at the chances of patient 0 showing up in Wuhan and the chances that the coronavirus that becomes a pandemic is a beta coronavirus from this particular group, that is to say, from the same group as generated SARS-CoV-1, the initial SARS, that the chances, they calculate the chance. If you scroll down here, Zach, scroll down to near the end of the article. They calculate the number if you combine the there it is. 1 in 630 that it will be in Wuhan, and 1 in 28 that it will be a close relative of the original SARS. And they calculate the combined number at 1 in 17,640. Now, I think their number is probably off by an order of magnitude, but, it is nonetheless an impressive degree. And, at some point I wouldn't mind talking with the authors of this about how I would alter their methodology to make it more robust. But the point is the likelihood calculation is so far away that they actually conclude, if you can go back to it, in the next paragraph here, the last sentence of the next paragraph says, a lab escape should at this point be the default hypothesis, which people who listened last week will remember was one of the arguments that we made, which is that effectively, because there is substantial evidence for a laboratory leak and because there is not evidence of a natural intermediate, that in fact lab leak has the status of the null hypothesis at this point. In other words, it is possible it came from nature, but that puts the burden on those who would argue that to find the intermediate. And absent that intermediate, the one plausible intermediate that we have is the laboratory.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this paper. This is the first time I've seen it, but I'm liking what I see here. Actually, the first part of that paragraph you just read the last sentence from. The criticism will doubtless be made that the geographic and the phylogenetic evidence described here are circumstantial, mere coincidences. But critiquing evidence as circumstantial is based on a common logical misconception, that circumstantial evidence represents a special category of evidence. As the philosopher David Hume first argued, all evidence of causation is composed of coincidences. All an observer can do is to add up the coincidences until they surmise that the threshold of reasonable doubt has been surpassed. Conclusions are always provisional, but in the absence of evidence to the contrary, anyone open to persuasion ought at this point to conclude the probability of 17,640 to 1 far exceeds that threshold. A lab escape should at this point be the default hypothesis. Now, I see there that they've elided a key part of the scientific process in their description there, right? Like that if you have the hypothesis before you find we have talked about this with regard to correlation and causation, right? Like correlation does not imply causation unless you predicted it in advance, right? And so their sort of approach from Hume-centric as opposed to more like Francis Bacon-centric, which is our sort of original approach, converge, I think, right? And so they land as well on this conclusion. What the default should be, and default hypothesis.
So this makes so many of the right points because, for one thing, people who've been with these live streams since the beginning will remember the very early period as we were trying to sort out what we were learning about coronavirus, and the field, all of the fields involved in this discussion had moved into a mode where, because there wasn't time for normal peer review, you couldn't wait a year for your paper to go through that process. Yeah. We were just working from the stuff on the archives, right? Now, the stuff on the archives is
the preprint servers. So archive was the name of one of the preprint servers.
The preprint servers, which are not yet peer reviewed. Right. Basically, it's a place to lodge papers that take the right form, but haven't been through that process. But it made for a very vibrant discussion in which many more people had access to the tools. It was messy. There was lots of wrong stuff there, right? So it didn't have the kind of quality control that comes from peer review, but the quality control that comes from peer review is anything but a hedge against bad information making into the literature. There's tons of bad information.
And increasingly, as we've talked about before here, peer review acts as these latter-day fact checkers, where they're motivated to, to a particular kind of research type of conclusion, people in particular that they want to have published, et cetera.
Right. Now, what I would point out is that this paper, which as far as I know is not peer reviewed, it takes the form of a peer reviewed paper, but it's published in a source that doesn't peer review, I think. It is logically evaluatable. I have concerns about the way it was done. And one of the conclusions is interesting. So these people advanced a hypothesis earlier that the intermediate was one of the miners in the Yunnan mine from which samples were taken. And they have a model in which the lungs of that miner basically served as a serial passage experiment. Now, I don't think this can be the case, but it is a viable hypothesis.
One of the miners who died? Or one of the...
I actually don't think it matters. I don't think we know. What we don't have is any evidence that those miners transmitted the virus to anybody. So if it is a lab, so their idea is it's a lab leak and that the sample was transmitted to the lab from which it leaked, but the sample was enhanced in the lungs of these miners through a natural evolutionary process. I don't believe that this can be the case.
Why?
Well, for a number of reasons. One, I believe that the selection, I don't believe that there's enough room for that selection to have taken place in a single individual. But their argument...
Well, and this is part of why I asked, one of the ones who, as I understood it, I thought that there were only, a handful of people who got it and they all died.
3 died.
Okay, so, this seems more plausible to me if it's from the lungs of one of the miners who survived, and therefore it may have had more, basically more generations in which to evolve within the lungs of that miner.
Yeah, I agree. Although if we're talking about SARS-CoV-2, then we're talking about something that the immune system does get wise to and, ultimately wins that battle. So anyway, we can talk about it. I agree that if you lived, there was a longer period of time potentially for that evolution to take place. But I don't believe a single miner's lungs are going to be enough. I remain to be convinced of whether that's true. But here's the other problem, is that there are 2 factors in the amazing capacity of SARS-CoV-2 at the point it shows up and hits the ground running in Wuhan, right? It's very good at invading tissues, and it's very good at getting between individuals. And all of the selection in the miner's lungs would have been in favor of invading tissues. It would not be super well adapted to
and
jump
as far as we know,
people.
it didn't go between tissues either. Didn't go between individuals, didn't go between tissues.
Well, that would certainly be an interesting question. I don't think we know that that's true because they died of what was called, I don't think it was even called viral pneumonia. It was understood to be a pneumonia. We now know it was a viral pneumonia. But it would be very interesting to know, what a full necropsy would have revealed about what other tissues were affected. There's a lot that could be settled if we had those samples, which I believe we just simply don't, and they might actually exist in somebody's freezer somewhere, which is another reason that we need to answer this question.
Right.
But nonetheless, these authors say they do exactly the right thing. They lay out all of their work, right? That work can be evaluated. I believe that they are off by something like a factor of 10, which still leaves a very impressive, 1,760 to 1 burden, which is way indication of direction, which is, I've said I think it's 90% or above. That's well above that. But in any case, the natural process can now unfold here outside of those who would fetter the conversation, right? We can, darn those fetterers.
I always liked how he played.
Well, I mean, he's gifted, but nonetheless, he's not a hero of free speech.
He might be. I don't know.
Sorry, Roger. That was uncalled for on my part. As far as I know, you might be a hero of free speech. I'm just not aware of it. But in any case, we can now have the discussion and say, look, here's how I would modify your method so that your approximation of the chances of this having happened by random would be more accurate. Might be I'm wrong. We'll find out. Might be they're wrong. They adjust their number. We could get a better number. But the point is, it's still a pretty impressive. The analysis itself, how you numeritize it, Is that a word?
No.
No. Okay, I propose numeritize becomes a word, but
okay.
how you
Numeritize.
quantify it? How you quantify it?
Yes.
It is an open question, but the analysis itself is, I believe, logically robust and very persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
And it suggests the burden of proof. Therefore, we are borrowing.
So you don't see any sign errors. You think the size of the estimate is off.
I think the size of the estimate is off, but the point is, it's the estimate is so profound that even at a tenth their strength, it's still overwhelming.
Still remarkable.
And then I think the question about, they say there are 4 lab leak hypotheses. It is very likely that their estimate on the strength of that likelihood is that it is one of these, and their point is we have advanced one. It could be any of the 4 or another, but it's likely to be in that quadrant and not a natural origin. And that is certainly an excellent place to have a high quality scientific discussion.